So we will begin in a moment. My name is Shane Bergin. I'm a physicist from UCD, and I suppose I feel very much part of the Science Communication Club in Ireland too. So it's my great pleasure to chair this afternoon's panel on creating a climate of trust in science. I am going to read you a little bit about our explanation for today. So we're thinking about trust, as I said, and as everyone knows, the COVID-19 pandemic raises very important questions about the role of science in society. It has become, in essence, a real-time test for trust in expertise. Since the beginning of the crisis, scientific experts have been in the centre of public attention, some as independent voices of government, others as direct advisors to politicians, often in uncomfortable positions, and perhaps too frequently these experts are contradicting one another. Some experts in Ireland have turned into celebrities, enjoying praise, but also recently receiving quite strong criticism, and even at times they have been the centre of political campaigns. And at the same time, the effectiveness of policies to tackle the pandemic rely to a huge extent on citizens' trust in those experts and in politicians in general in charge of the urgent decisions. So I hope that you would agree that this is a timely discussion to talk about creating a climate of trust in science. So welcome to everyone. There is a questions and answer section over on the right. There's also the chat function. So please make sure to stay in touch with us. We're very keen to involve you as much as possible and to work with your questions as they come up. So to kick off proceedings, I'm going to ask my fellow panelists to introduce themselves and perhaps as they do so, tell us what they think can help one identify a trustworthy expert. So let's begin with my colleague and friend, Professor Maria Baghramian. Maria.
Hi, I'm Maria Baghramian. I'm Professor of American Philosophy at University College Dublin, and I'm the coordinator of an EU project on trust in experts in policy matters called PERITIA. So, well, Shane, I'm afraid there isn't a very simple one-liner answer to your questions. I'm going to give you the full gamut because the issue of trusted experts and what makes for a trustworthy expert is a complicated issue. I think as a rule of thumb, we can use three markers or rely on three markers in establishing the trustworthiness of an expert. The first marker generally is the credentials markers. These are there are indicators there such as educational background, esteem by peers, track record of publications in peer-reviewed journals, etc. So those are the credentials that the expert has. The second set of markers has to do with what I suppose we can call the integrity of the person, their trustworthiness based in terms of their truthfulness, their honesty, their openness, their transparency, and the care they show towards their subject and the people who are affected by their subject. And then the third marker that I would use to establish trustworthiness is the most complicated marker probably, and I would like to call it a performance marker. The performance marker brings in, first and foremost, the track record of the person, how they have behaved in the context of their relevant expertise in the past, but also it involves, if you would like, extracurricular indicators. The case of Professor Neil Ferguson in UK was a prime example of this. Neil Ferguson was a member of SAGE and a very eminent virologist and expert in his area, easily satisfied the first criterion. He had all the credentials. And as far as we know, he was completely transparent and truthful about his scientific findings and the way he presented his data, etc. However, if you remember from that period, he did violate the SAGE guidelines on social distancing and self-isolation, etc., for purely selfish and personal reasons. And for that, he had to resign from SAGE because he wasn't deemed to be a trustworthy expert anymore, not because of his credentials or even truthfulness, but because of his behavior at that particular time. So it's this combination of these three markers that make for a trustworthy expert.
Well, that's interesting, Maria, because as I look at the poll that people have been completing, we've asked people to choose. I know it's difficult when you have to pick one, and it's perhaps a little bit of all. To trust an expert, what quality matters most to you? We see that half the people have said authenticity. So perhaps Professor Ferguson there is, that level of authenticity about do what I do rather than do what I say. So we might move on to our next panelist this afternoon, Professor Luke Drury. Luke, if you tell us about yourself and what for you makes an expert trustworthy.
Thanks, Shane. I'm an astrophysicist, so you may wonder what I'm doing on this panel, but I've been working for a number of years with Maria on these issues in an interdisciplinary project funded by the Irish Research Council initially, and then through my work with ALIA, the Federation of European Academies. So I've got very interested in this issue. I fully agree with everything Maria has said, but I would make a slight distinction. I think it's very dangerous to put your trust in one individual. I mean, in science, what is important actually is to trust the community of scientists, not an individual. You can always find a contrarian or some scientist who's got an odd opinion. But if you find, as in climate, for example, that 99% of the professionals who've worked on a field agree on something, then you're justified in putting your trust in that. So certainly as far as the individuals are concerned, all the markers, the credentials, etc., that Maria has pointed to are appropriate. But I think we have also to emphasize the social aspect, that it is the community of scientists that we trust, not one individual, but the fact that there's a consensus among a large group of people who have all worked intensively on this, argued about it, discussed it, invested heavily in studying it. And that's really what we trust.
Indeed, absolutely. Thank you, Luke. And as you're listening, folks, please do feel free to add comments in the chat area or questions in the Q&A. Next, may I ask Teresa Branch-Smith to tell us about herself and what for her makes an expert trustworthy. Teresa.
Hello. I'm a researcher at Institut Nicod in France, working on how we decide on trustworthy experts using social indicators of trust. So unsurprisingly, my answer draws heavily on that in talking about values. And I think to determine who is a reputable expert and who to put your trust in, we should consider how these scientists or scientific communities present values in science and respond to the values of publics. So, for example, when I see a scientist claim to do their work objectively, that immediately raises a red flag.
So I think that's quite interesting, because when I was an undergraduate, I would have certainly kind of signed up to that view of science, as in I was finding objective truths. And it didn't matter whether I was, a white man in Ireland doing it compared to someone else who was different in a different place, that they would arrive at the same thing, and that it was value free. So you feel that there are inherent values to being a scientist, and is it important that we talk about them?
Absolutely. There are values, be they epistemic or non-epistemic, and they can both be used for good and evil. And being aware of those values, being transparent about them, I think is really important to restoring faith in science and accurately representing science.
Very interesting. We'll come back to that, given the community of science communicators that are here today. Finally, Hamid Khan, would you mind telling us who you are, where you come from, and what for you makes an expert trustworthy in science? And Hamid, we can't hear you, unfortunately. You might unmute yourself. Hamid, perhaps you might leave and rejoin, and you'll be able to share your audio and video feed, and we'll come back to you in a moment. I have another question for our three panelists here, and it's, you know, like we're really we're in the middle of a pandemic, and the role of expertise in science has been very evident for members of the public. However, we are in the 21st century where populist views are on the rise, and there has been associated with that a real broadening of the types of media that are available to people. I wonder, is this the worst time to have a pandemic, given those conditions? Perhaps Maria, you might like to come in on that.
So, well, not to coin a new phrase, I think we are in the best of times and worst of times for a pandemic, and for some very similar reasons, in fact. The worst of times because we are living in a congested and fully interconnected world. So a virus such as COVID-19 took off immediately and spread to all corners of the world in ways that the flu pandemic of the early 20th century could not do. And at the same time, because we are digitally completely interconnected, the information or disinformation and misinformation virus travels like lightning as well and has exactly the same effect. We are also living in the best of times, because without that interconnectedness and the technological advances, we couldn't have made the amazing discoveries about vaccination, genetic typing of the viruses, the various cures that have been found, and altogether the sort of forces that we have mobilized in fighting the virus are dependent on that interconnectedness and technological advances. So in a funny way, I think COVID-19 is the best representation of the world we live in, both digitally and in terms of our connectedness. And this is an opportunity for us to learn from the pandemic and maybe find the best of ways for living in this world that faces us and into the future that will be dictated by connectivity.
Absolutely. Teresa or Luke, would you like to build on that?
Well, I mean, if I can come in, Shane, I mean, there's never a good time to have a pandemic. So, but I would agree with Maria. I mean, I think it could have been far worse. I mean, one could have imagined easily a pandemic with a higher mortality rate. One could have easily imagined in earlier times, we wouldn't have had the technology to diagnose it rapidly, to understand it, to come up within 1 year with effective vaccines is amazing, actually. And we shouldn't forget that that builds on decades of fundamental research. I mean, if we didn't have that foundation of fundamental biological research, we would not have been in this position. On the other hand, it also exposes a lot of weaknesses. I mean, there has been a terrible lack of social cohesion at the global level. We're seeing a distressing rise of vaccine nationalism, people grabbing what they can for themselves. There's a lack of thinking of the world as a global integrated system. And this is hopefully one of the things that will come out of this is a greater appreciation of the fact that we are all interconnected. We have to either hang together or hang separately, to use an old phrase.
Well, I think it's a good point. Teresa, I might ask you. So Andrew McGovern has entered the chat and said that the poll we put out was very interesting, in that science communicators, those who are at this conference, have valued authenticity above all else when as an indicator of trust. What do you think of that?
That doesn't shock me. Especially when you have the two expert problem where you're deciding between experts, assuming their competence is equal or comparable, and assuming that they have the credentials, what it comes down to is a characteristic that's usually quite value-laden that indicates to publics and to other scientists that this person is trustworthy. And to bring it back to your question on populism in the pandemic, this isn't the first time populism and science have crossed paths. I doubt it will be the last time. But what's interesting is our response to it and the science that we do. And I think it'll be really curious in the next few years what our response is as a result. Do we come together as communities to work on solutions for everyone, or do we have this dramatic stratification of those with resources and access and those that don't?
Thank you. Hamid, I'd love to bring you in. However, I see that you're still on mute, unfortunately. So if you're able to resolve that at the top of your screen, I'll see your camera change to live, and I'll certainly bring you in. But I'm afraid you can use the chat function if you'd like to add anything. Fergus says, please check your direct messages. He'll be able to help you with that. Sorry, Luke, you were going to come in there.
I just wanted to add that one of the, this is slightly off topic, but one of the really interesting impacts of COVID has been on the way science itself is conducted. I'm very interested in the whole area of open access and open data. And this has been really driven forward at enormous speed by the needs of responding to COVID. So preprints, a few years ago, people were still debating whether or not preprints were a legitimate mode of communicating science. I mean, this is a debate we never had in physics, I have to say, but it was certainly one in chemistry and biology. Now everyone accepts that preprints are a valuable and effective means of accelerating science. Open sharing of data has become much more common now as a result of this. And I can't see us ever going back, to be quite honest. And these are some of the benefits of it. Yeah,
absolutely. And it speaks to that point you raised earlier about science being a collective for social enterprise. Maria, you have a point you'd like to raise.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Luke whether he doesn't think that this open access and preprint practice, which has huge advantages, of course, doesn't also run the danger of going against proper peer review and things getting out before they have been tested and peer reviewed properly. There were a number of examples like that, particularly in the early days of COVID, that the information was out there, the media and the science communicators picked up on this, and misinformation spread very quickly. And then once the misinformation is out, it's very difficult for the scientists to correct it, even though they may know that they have retracted their initial article.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think that you can, Luke. Sorry,
I was just going to respond to that. I mean, that's a valid concern, but I think one has to say on the other side that peer review is not the brilliant silver bullet it's often claimed to be. I mean, some of the most dangerous, misleading articles have been through peer review. I think of MMR vaccine and the Wakefield article in The Lancet, for example. So it's by no means a guarantee of quality. I think if people understand that preprints are still debatable and not to be taken as gospel truth, then it's perfectly legitimate to publish them. Equally, I think it's a common misunderstanding in the general public. They think if something has been peer reviewed, it's guaranteed to be absolutely correct. This is simply not true. We all know as scientists that there's a vast amount of peer-reviewed literature which is frankly just wrong.
Yes, and I could add that there's also this sense, as you said, of certainty that comes with peer-reviewed findings. And it kind of reminds me of the question that's been put to us by Martin Billingham. And Martin says, how can we square the circle between trust and communicating scientific uncertainty? In other words, if science is by its nature somewhat uncertain or limited in what it says, perhaps it whispers more than shouts, how can we talk about trust in that environment? Teresa, would you like to talk to us about that?
That's a really tough question and a really good one, because on one hand, you want to be forthcoming about what it is that we're communicating, that uncertainty in science, which is endemic to science itself. But publics will have to accept that answers can change. And I think part of that has to do with improving science education and building that into curriculums and public understandings of science that include that science isn't perfect, it's a process, but that leaves room to valorize consensus. When we do have high degrees of agreement from various domains of science about certain topics, that strengthens those conclusions.
Yeah, I read this morning in my preparation about the notion of trust in science in the 17th and 18th century was very much associated with trust the so-called great man, that if he or she said it, that was it. And that more modern versions have looked far more at what you're describing as in the process and the social underpinnings. But I want to ask Maria, given this conversation, right, Maria, what would you say are things that scientists and science communicators can do to either establish or perhaps re-establish a climate of trust in science?
So I think establishing or re-establishing or creating and maintaining a climate of trust should be a collective effort, not up to scientists alone, not up to science communicators, even in conjunction with scientists, but all the various stakeholders, which means basically all adult population of any given country, have a role in creating and maintaining a climate of trust. So scientists, we talked about how they can be trustworthy, what the markers for their trustworthiness is. Science communicators, through their vigilance in reporting correctly, fairly, putting aside their bias, fighting against their unconscious biases, and avoid sensationalism. Policymakers and governmental officials in trying to make sure that they are not abusing the scientific advice they are receiving, to not to use it for political gains or even worse for personal gains. And then the general public, they are as much responsible for this as anyone else. A fake information or false news is one click away from all of us. So before clicking, if we just stop and think about it, that will also help establishing a climate of trust. So I don't want to put the onus on science communicators or scientists, and I don't want to say that only lack of education leads to a breakdown of trust, or deficit, or knowledge deficit leads to breakdown of trust. Trust is complex, trust is fragile, trust takes time to build, and it's very easy to dismantle. So we have all to see our stake in this game and play together as a social goal.
May I add to the question to you? Like in terms of, you think of trust, it's, as you say, it's complex, right? So what is the difference between trusting something and believing something?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. So the standard response to this question is trust is reliance plus. So in trusting, the necessary condition for trusting is to agree to rely. Just believing does not necessarily involve reliance, but trusting always involves reliance. But reliance by itself, following philosophers such as Annette Bayer, I would like to claim, is not enough for trusting. The famous example that Bayer gives is a detective who relies on a burglar to lead him to the loot, but you can't say that he trusts the burglar. In the same way about scientists, I might rely on the data produced by a particular scientist, but knowing his propensity to exaggerate and to use the data for his own gains, etc., I may not trust him as a scientist, even if I might use the data on a certain occasion. So what's that plus element? The plus is the acceptance that there is goodwill involved on the part of the person we are trusting. And that's why the poll on authenticity comes close to this philosophical view of trust. Trust is reliance plus authenticity, goodwill.
So I have a really good question to follow here from my colleague in UCD, Sheila Lane, who's formerly a Paratia. Sheila has asked, given so much science now is happening with computer models, algorithms, so-called big data, should there be different criteria then, Luke, for trusting that sort of stuff, where the person is far more removed, and thus it's harder to establish trust in them? You know, how do we trust that sort of science?
Well, that's a great question. The real problem here is the rise of machine learning, where we don't really understand what the algorithms are doing. But in one sense, this is nothing new. I mean, the whole move of science has been to move away from things we can directly perceive into things we can only perceive through mediation of complicated instruments. The most extreme example, of course, being high energy physics, where there's no way you can directly perceive what's happening in that realm, but we have instruments which we trust, and we trust the technicians who build the instruments, and we are very careful in analyzing the data. I mean, if I think of some physics experiments, I know we go to great lengths actually to be reasonably confident in the algorithms. I mean, I was involved with the Hess telescopes, where we had two completely distinct analysis chains, one developed by scientists in Paris, one developed by scientists in Heidelberg. And unless the two analysis chains gave essentially the same answer, we didn't believe the results and we didn't publish them.
Wow.
And the other examples, I mean, the detection of gravitational waves, they actually deliberately injected fake signals into the system to see if they were detected and analyzed, and then only at the end they they announced whether it was real or fake, to try and get rid of the biases, because it's, as you know, it's so easy to see what you want to see in data. So we have to be very careful. But this is what science is about. It's actually trying to extract knowledge out of data.
And Ty, you might follow on that. And I'm thinking about, your work and looking for key indicators. In other words, I think of the analogies with the experiments that Luke's talking about, and the removed high energy astrophysics, etc. How can we trust the sort of stuff that you're doing? Not you per se, but yours is very trustworthy. But the field. How can we believe when people say, oh, the public have huge trust in scientists? Like, what's the basis for that?
Yeah, so going back to this idea of the black box with machine learning, and as we increasingly rely on AI in a vast majority of fields and our everyday lives, there's a real call to decide, okay, so how do we get publics to move from reliance on these technologies to trust in them? And one solution has been to, okay, so we'll trust maybe the scientists as individuals or the engineers as individuals who write these algorithms, or, who set up the computers that will figure them out or come to these conclusions about the data. And that's a solution, but I think it's a bit short on what we're aiming for. It's not quite trust in the mechanism itself, which is ultimately blind to us in some ways. And so as a result, we're forced to go to other social indicators of trust or cues in our environment that suggest to us why and what algorithms or research groups are more trustworthy than others. And I think, like in Luke's example, when you have research groups that are not solely relying on their own data or mechanisms, but are willing to cross-check that with others before publishing and are transparent about those methodological processes, that gives us further reason to trust in these results.
So, Hamid, you're here at last. It's lovely to have you with us. Can you hear me, Hamid? No, unfortunately not. He might join us in a moment. He's a great guy that has wonderful things to say. Maria, I'd like to build on what Ty was talking about. And she, the idea of the way science is portrayed there sounds great, right? But during a pandemic, it doesn't sound that realistic because things are happening in real time, and people want vaccines yesterday, etc. And there wouldn't the space given to the experiments that are happening at the moment. Compared to the ones that Luke described for gravitational waves, where no one really cared if the results came out in July or December. But during a pandemic, the public are very interested in getting immediate or real-time science. And in that space, there can be a lot of disagreement, as we're living in the middle of it. How do we cope with that? How do we manage that disagreement and still maintain trust in science?
Okay, so good. Yeah, that's a very difficult question during a pandemic or in more normal times. I think we should start, and this is something that science communicators can do and do actually do. We should start by making it very clear that disagreement is part of science. It's actually one of the strengths of science, not one of its weaknesses. There are institutionalized ways of expressing disagreement in science, and that helps to strengthen science. The scientific theory that survives most of the disagreements thrown at it is the best we have at any given time. So that's one thing that we can hopefully convey now during a pandemic or later on. Secondly, I think we could also clarify that consensus is the best method of accepting scientific theories at any given time. Science is fallible and it accepts its fallibility. Any scientist who claims certainty is not a scientist at all. So-called fallibilism, accepting that at any given time you can be completely wrong, is part of the method of science. So what you can put forward is the best argument or the best solution available at a given time. And that's just the reality of it now during the pandemic or later on. Scientists are not magicians, and they cannot produce what cannot be produced. So this is how science should be portrayed. And if it's disappointing, well, to some extent, but it's the best we have. We have nothing other than the vaccine route for fighting, and other than listening to the advice that comes from scientific experts who may make mistakes and have made mistakes, but the trustworthy scientist comes out and admits to his or her mistake and then tries to find a better solution.
And that might answer the question from Anonymous, who said, how do you go about equipping the public with tools to assess trust? And Ty's mentioned education is wonderful, but this person said it's slow. What do you do? And you need some tools now. I suppose that point you've raised, Maria, is very valid, that a trustworthy expert will admit when they're wrong. I don't know how many times during the pandemic I've looked at the news and said, if that politician could just back down a little bit and say, I got it wrong, and then crucially not have the head taken off them by the media for doing so, we'd all be in an awful lot a better mental health space for sure. Can I ask a question to you all that perhaps follows in that? And we will stay on this idea of disagreement for a moment. Josh Matthews has an interesting point. He says, to what extent does the representation affect trust? In other words, is it harder for underrepresented groups to trust experts when they don't identify with that group? Perhaps, he says, is it easier for the Irish public to trust the WHO because Mike Ryan, the doctor in the WHO, is an Irish person? Does anyone have any comments on that representation effect?
I think it's a very valid point.
Yeah. Go ahead.
It comes back to what Maria was. It comes back to what Maria was saying, that trust is more than just accepting somebody's credentials. You have to feel that they have empathy with you, that you can identify with them, and there indeed an identification effect does kick in. I mean, we're human, I'm afraid.
So yes, I completely agree with that, but like most things, there are negative sides to that identification. So we bring in our social biases and our unconscious biases. I think there is a propensity to trust those whom we know better, and our own social grouping consists of people with whom we have values in common. And this is something that maybe Ty would like to speak to, the role of values in trust. So we do need to be very careful in thinking through these issues. But as you, Shane, mentioned, during pandemics, there isn't that much time to think these things. But it's one of the things that hopefully we will learn from this period of horrendous isolation and deprivation, and take it how to measure the ways in which we can bring these social, personal, and value judgments into our acts of trust and attitudes of trust.
Yeah, Ty, would you like to follow there with your work on values?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize and acknowledge that certain groups have good reason not to trust certain institutions and certain types of scientific expertise. And these reasons aren't just new, they're historical. And that's important from a communication standpoint when we think of publics and the diversity within publics. One message for everyone won't necessarily work. And granted, in a pandemic, there is this need for information quickly in order to make informed decisions. And I'm very sympathetic to that, especially in the initial stages where using sort of didactic or deficit model communication is not only the most efficient in some ways, but the most effective, at least in the short term, of getting knowledge out there. But what can be done, and as this seems to be a long pandemic period that we're going through, is have conversations adjacent to these information distribution opportunities. When we have direct communication happening, you can also have discourse on the side with different groups in different ways and formats that they perhaps are more receptive to, so you can have some sort of genuine bi-directional discourse.
Okay, I think that sounds great. And I'm going to say something that, given it's SciComm, I think is a little controversial. I think science communicators haven't been that present in the debate on the pandemic. Anyone have any comment on that? Perhaps in the chat, maybe I'm wrong. Or perhaps I might ask the panel, what might science communicators do to kind of enact what Ty has just spoken about, these extra things, these deeper conversations? What sort of stuff can we create or facilitate? People love controversy, they say in the chat. Anyway.
If I can come in, Shane, I mean, I think one thing that science communicators often do is focus too much on the so-called facts and not enough on the process. I mean, really, what has come through, I've just been looking at some of the chat comments, I mean, it is very important to convey how science works more than what science tells you. People need to understand the process of science, that it doesn't involve absolute truth. It involves the best explanation we can find at the moment. It is, as Maria says, fallible by design almost. And it's important that people understand the limits of science and that it is a process done by a community of scientists. It's not something that is out there independent of humanity.
Well, maybe I'd follow that. Often it's perceived as independent of the humanities. So, you know, yourself and Maria have certainly blazed a trail on the Irish scene and on how to, you know, really bridge that divide and for the humanities and the sciences to work together in a way that's meaningful for both. Luke, you might tell us a little bit about the experience of working with a philosopher as a scientist to more deeply understand, you know, the process of science that you're engaged with on a day-to-day level. Maria's smiling.
Well, it's like all things. There's quite a culture shock actually when you move into a different sphere, because you find that things you thought were absolutely standard, which everybody did, are completely foreign in the other domain. So the whole culture of asking questions at talks is quite different in philosophy, actually. It's very interesting, but it is enriching. And I think both Maria and myself would say that working together has been, well, not always easy, but certainly productive. Shall we agree on
yes,
that?
Yes, no, definitely. Yeah.
But I mean, I think it comes back to the point that we've been making, that you need to trust science. You need to understand how scientists work and how the sociology of science works. It certainly isn't a matter of just believing in something called science. And in fact, I have a big problem, as you know, with the use of the word belief. I mean, I think it's very dangerous to ask people to believe in science. You should understand how science is created as a human endeavor and understand the process, and then you should trust the results of that endeavor. But you don't believe in it in the sense that you believe in religion, for example.
Yeah, I think that is a fair point, and you've made it several times. I've tended to agree with you on it, Luke. I note from Brian Trenchon in the chats that Brian said he agrees with the relative invisibility of professional science communicators in the pandemic. He adds, of course, we don't know what may be going on in the background, and I'd certainly be very interested to hear from people through the chat as to what things are going on in the background. You know, I kind of silent communication, is it communication, or perhaps it's just more local. Others are generally agreeing with the point that science communicators haven't been that visible in the pandemic so far. I'd love to hear from those who've said that, why they feel that has been the case. Have they felt barriers to participation in the discussion? I want to go, and perhaps based on that, just to put to you that often when we have debates about live issues, such as those that are coming up in the pandemic, it can be set up in a very so-called balanced way by the media, where we have a person saying X and then a person saying 1 over X. And you like that as opposed to Y. And that and that's seen as the appropriate way to do it. Ty, would you agree that that's the best way to have a debate?
Oh, Shane, I think you know that I would not.
Well, go on. Do tell us why.
Well, I mean, it obviously has the risk of misrepresenting the issue. It makes it appear as if both sides are equally well-researched, well-funded, well-supported, when that might not necessarily be the case. That said, I think it's important to show that there is disagreement in science, to accurately represent science, but not necessarily to the point where everyone is either an expert or just all sorts of fringe experts have the same amount of time to convey their point as those that have consensus around them and more represent the state of the art as it is.
Okay, thank you so much. I think that's very important. Maria, in terms of the adversarial nature often of media interactions in science, do you think it contributes to or takes away from the climate of trust we're looking to create?
So while I have praised and emphasized the role of disagreement in science, and I think we should accept and actually cherish it, I think what is really very negative and damaging in the way science is presented by the media is the false equivalences that are created in the name of giving both sides an equal chance. When there is a consensus in one area of science where 99% agree on a particular issue, you don't bring in the representative of the 1% minority view and give them the equal voice. The same happens in politics as well. The way that the representatives of conspiracy theories and vaccine deniers, etc., are given the same level of exposure as the majority of people in Ireland and elsewhere who don't believe in conspiracy theories, who don't believe in vaccine denying and so on. So those false equivalences, it's as if the media feels that it's part of their ethical duty to give equal credibility to two sides, and that's just wrong. That's simply wrong. There's no ethical duty to do that. I mean, in philosophy, we can put on courses if the media wants on why this is ethically not required of them.
Well, Owen Gill in the chat has said that he said in an earlier session, Mark Little said that it was basically his job on prime time to give 7 minutes to each side. I feel like it's watching a boxing match, and as a scientist, there's no way I would go on it to take part in a conversation about anything that even if I felt quite expert in it, I'd feel very, very exposed, and I wouldn't feel comfortable doing it. And it's sort of then the thing that's put to you is, well, if you don't do it, someone is going to do it. And then what's going to be said? It kind of, it puts the pressure on experts to take part in things. Luke, you want to come in?
I've always wondered whether this isn't a particularly Anglophonic problem, coming from our common law tradition of an adversarial court system and the tradition of university debating societies. And I'd be interested in, Ty, I mean, in France, do you have the same issue of false equivalence?
Oh, bien sûr.
Yeah.
So yes.
Okay.
I think it's actually quite widespread now, and that's part of this sort of clickbait culture that we're in, right? It's dramatic if it's presented in this way. You have more exciting clips to share, and I mean, ultimately, there's an incentive in media outlets to generate content that gets people watching, and a sort of, I don't want to say a slug match, but an all-out debate, even if the sides aren't really evenly matched, is good watching.
So may I add, and it's one of the questions you again, Ty, might be able to help with. It's like people are saying, at the moment, perhaps the lack of visibility for science communicators has been that media want to hear direct from the horse's mouth, so-called. So they want to hear from the scientists themselves. And that makes me think, well, maybe the scientist isn't the best person to go on and to talk about it. It might be better to have the intermediary, to think of the role of the intermediary in establishing trust in the science as opposed to the scientists. So, would you encourage science communicators to step into that divide?
I definitely would, because I think communicating science well is an art form. It's really difficult to do, and scientists are not trained in it. They aren't trained to attend to not only their language and their rapport, but with the speaker, but also to the audience. And I think science communication and communicators in general, as knowledge brokers, have a really valuable part to play as a liaison between publics and the scientific community. What's also a benefit of having science communicators in that role is that they can serve as a check to scientists who might be tempted to say that this science is definitive, or I'm sure, or it's value-free, right? They have this extra added layer of separation between them and science, assuming that they have this sort of intersectional expertise needed to understand the science to really add an extra layer of verification that I think publics would really benefit from.
Yes, Owen Gill says, should RT hire a science/medical specialist journal for the remainder of the pandemic? It kind of follows from a thread of things in the chat where people are asking, are journalists science communicators? I would say firmly no. I'd say they're journalists, and there's nothing wrong with that. Does anyone disagree with me here on the panel?
Well, if a journalist works if a science communicator works also as a journalist, then the two roles can come together. There shouldn't be an opposition. It's a question of what sort of job title you have in a paper such as the Irish Times, which has been traditionally, I think, quite good in presenting science, I must say that, and also presenting philosophy. So I think that's one area where the Irish Times excel.
Yes, sorry, Luke, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I think there is a role for people who specialize in this job of communicating the complexity and ambiguity of science. I have to say that, I mean, as professional scientists, we actually spend a lot of our time training ourselves to communicate in a very strange way among ourselves.
We certainly do.
We learn professional jargon. We learn a lot of professional jargon. We learn to write papers in a very impersonal style. and this is not actually effective in communicating to the public. So there is a role, I feel, for people who bridge this gap, but it's a very difficult one. I mean, you have on the one hand to understand the science, but you also have to have these communication skills. And it's not one that the average journalist can just step into. I mean, I think you do need people who have special skill sets.
I couldn't agree more. Phil Smith adds, he thinks that sometimes good scientists get trained out of communicating well.
That was my point.
Yeah, I've, you know, a Science by Press release has for me done my head in through the years, and I think perhaps I would associate that with complex funding mechanisms, etc., where it's quite performative. See, Ty, you're nodding. Do you agree with me on that?
Yeah, I do. And it's weird, the Academy, in that way, in that we want our researchers to do outreach work, to communicate outside of the Academy, but then don't offer much support on how to do it, and then don't value it in the same way when it comes to looking at things like tenure. And so that's another reason why it only sort of becomes a performative gesture, but not something that's really taken on as important to how we see ourselves as researchers.
So
in fact, it's even worse actually, that there's a gatekeeping function where if you do too much public outreach, you're regarded as not a proper scientist.
So can, as a philosopher, I act as a contrarian here and say that, of
course.
Yeah, so as I see it, the role of science communicators is just to do that, to communicate science accurately and truthfully, without exaggeration, etc. And that's a wonderful role to have. But that's just education. I think building trust is more than just education. The assumption that people don't trust because they don't know enough about science, I think that's the wrong place to start from. Lack of knowledge is and can be a factor, but there is more to breakdown of trust when it happens than just lack of knowledge. And that's where we need to go beyond the act of trying to teach people and to try and establish connections between scientists and the general public. And that's very difficult for all the reasons you pointed out, but it's also necessary.
I completely agree. I see Luke typing. I suspect he's replying to something I'm going to ask him to reply to verbally, which is from Fanny Riviera Ortiz, and she says, if it's not proper to say I believe in science, then what? What should we say as humans? What to do about science? How will you recognize it and stick to it? She suggests trust in science might be better.
I would say trust in the community of scientists and the methods they use.
So could we, as we're coming to the end of our session here today, as we're talking about creating a climate of trust in science and trust in scientists and the community of scientists, should we trust in the community of science communicators? Can we extend that? I certainly hope we could.
Yes, but it has to be justified.
Yes, okay, Luke. So you said it has to be justified. Would you like to extend on that a little bit?
Well, there's nothing more dangerous than blind trust.
Okay, yes.
And I think Maria would agree that
absolutely.
Trust depends, you have to have reasonable grounds for trust.
Yeah.
Okay, so Maria, could you build on that and say, well, how does that apply then to the science communicator? And I know you've touched on that already.
Yeah, well, some of the criteria that I outlined right at the beginning about the markers of trustworthiness, some of them apply to science communicators as well. So their professional credentials, what they have done with their work, and then their integrity and honesty and openness, all these things that are markers for the trustworthiness of scientists are also markers for trustworthiness of other professions, including science communicators. So it's just that the domain is slightly different, but the markers are very similar.
I have to add, my good friend Declan Cathcart, who teaches with me in UCD, has said, it's just occurred to me you should have Richard Dawkins on the panel in the name of balance.
talk about controversy.
Absolutely. So I have a question here from Ruth Freeman, who says, and perhaps going back to the issue of belief, she says, what does it mean to say to someone, I believe in you? Is that different to I believe to believe the science?
I think I'll pass to Maria on this
Right,
as a philosopher.
Yeah. So usually when we say I believe in you, we mean that I believe in the set of claims you make, or I believe that you will take the appropriate action, etc. When we say I believe in science, that is, I agree with Luke, that's very problematic, because the science is full of different branches, different theories, etc. Of course, you can believe or disbelieve in a theory or be agnostic, believe it's appropriate in that way. I believe in the evolution theory, and think anyone who does not believe in that is daft at this stage in our history. I'm full of scorn. I'm not ashamed to say I'm full of scorn for anyone who doesn't believe in evolution theory, but that's a very different claim from saying that I believe in science. What aspect of science? What claims of science?
We have a suggestion from Josh Matthews. Ty, I'll put it to you. Josh suggests engage with science as perhaps a better mantra. What would you think of that?
I adore the idea of engagement with science, be it both publics or science communicators. I think there's an opportunity there to have a more bidirectional idea of science, where not only is science responsive to the needs of publics and their questions, but also informed by publics and their areas of interest. And so in that way, I think we can build epistemic communities that are more engaged and more transparent and therefore more trustful.
I couldn't agree more. It makes me think of a person I know in the United States, Noah Finkelstein, who talks about education as a process of enculturalization. Only American could use a great word like that, but it kind of speaks to what you're talking about, and that it's a process of doing science, engaging with science. It brings you into it. You build trust because you get to know people. You get to know about the process of how science works. And I'm kind of touching here on lots of ideas that Luke, yourself, and Maria, and I'm sure Hamid, had he been able to switch on the microphone, would have been able to say too. Nee Faulkner in the chats agrees with Josh. Josh, I think you're onto a winner there. We have lots of nice things coming through on the chat as we come to the end. To the audience, all 84 of you, may we say thank you for your really meaningful engagement. I'm not a fan of teaching online, as my colleagues will know. However, I'm very aware that without it, I'd be just sitting at home reading books on my own at the moment. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity to interact with you, albeit remotely today. And I'm sure that on behalf of the panel here, they too are very grateful. Before we finish, I'd like to point to a couple of events that are taking place soon. So Maria, as she mentioned, is leading a European-funded project called Peritia, which is investigating public trust in science. And there is a series of public lectures, the first from the great Naomi Oreskes, who we've mentioned today a number of times. Naomi is speaking on the 6th of April at 4 p.m. Irish time. You can check out the Peritia Twitter or website to subscribe to that lecture and the subsequent ones that come after it. Maria, I hope I've captured that okay for you.
Yes. And just to add that there will be occasions for asking questions and engaging. So given the very active engagement with the debate here, I hope we'll see more of that during our lecture series as well.
Indeed, and we mentioned Hamid has pasted a number of links, particularly for young early career researchers, in the chat function there, if you'd like to have a look at it. We have Owen Gill also mentioning the Robert Boyle lecture series on the 22nd of March. robertboyle.ie. Lots of good stuff, folks, for us to engage with, right, Ty? As we leave today, I've certainly never, as a scientist, believed in it. I've certainly felt at times I can trust it, but I've always felt, and I hope you too will, can say that we can all engage with science. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much, and thank you to the panel for a very, very enlightening and pleasing conversation today.
Thank you. Thank you, Shane, for a great job.
Thank you.
Take care,
everyone.
folks. Bye-bye now.
Nice chatting to you. Bye-bye. Bye.